Welcome to A-Push. We've been here for almost a week now, so it's time to finally shift our focus up to North America and bring in some of the familiar characters and faces that you recognize from your childhood. So, objectives for today: take a moment, familiarize yourself, copy down if necessary, and again, we'll be back to them at the end. All right, so let's ruin some childhood memories. It's important to note that the English and the French were not involved in early colonization because the French were concerned with internal politics in the 14 and 1500s, and the English had a series of issues involving succession and wars of religion and fighting off massive Spanish fleets. And so for the most part, the English operated as pirates and privateers, attacking Spanish ships rather than direct colonial actions of their own. Most famously, Sir Francis Drake was one of Elizabeth's sea dogs or privateers or pirates, depending on who you ask, who was knighted for his actions of attacking Spanish ships and stealing their stuff, which, noble. This, of course, was one of the factors that convinced the Spanish to launch the Spanish Armada. The other one, of course, being, Elizabeth's return to Protestantism and some dynastic politics that you don't need to get into here. But, of course, the Spanish Armada was defeated, Spain's power began to wane, and England got an opportunity to get into the colonial game for themselves. Other European countries getting involved. The Dutch were just starting to embark on their future as a massive trading and commercial empire. The French were emerging from their dynastic struggles, and the Bourbon dynasty was starting to reach out. And the Swedish got temporarily involved, but not enough to really even mention here. I mean, I mentioned them, but yeah. And then, of course, the Russians did eventually move into Alaska, but not substantially. The first colony to be established in North America was Roanoke. Roanoke Colony, or the Lost Island of Roanoke, as we can see here, is off the coast of North Carolina, and it was a singular venture by Sir Walter Raleigh, who, of course, made his fame as one of the architects of the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Raleigh paid for the establishment of Roanoke Colony, and so they built this little fort on this island, and then the ships went back to England to get supplies, but the ships were delayed for a time, and it took more than a year for the ships to return. And when the ships finally returned, they found the word Croatan carved in a tree, and the settlement abandoned. Still to this day, no one really knows what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke. Our assumption is that they didn't know how to survive, and the settlers ran out of food and integrated with a local Native American tribe. Of course, they also may have been massacred or starved to death or, aliens or something. But I'm going to go with integrated with a local Native American tribe. So Roanoke is gone, and all of the money that Sir Walter Raleigh paid in order to establish this colony also gone. Since the Queen of England didn't have the money to finance these colonies, and rich English people were now aware of the potential massive financial loss that could be suffered if one of these colonies failed, this led to a sort of spreading out of risk and the creation of joint stock companies. Joint stock companies are basically the idea that you get a whole bunch of people together and they buy shares in this venture with the idea that these shares would then pay out money if the colony was successful. This way, if the colony succeeds, a number of people can make a somewhat healthy profit, whereas if the colony fails, you only lose a small portion, or you only lose the part of the colony that you financed, rather than one person taking the whole loss. But it should be noted that all of these colonies were commercial ventures, with the goal being to make money for their investors. And so that is a key component of all of these English colonies. The second colony that the English established in North America was Jamestown in 1607. You're probably aware of this one. The Virginia Company of London financed an expedition to set up a colony in North America. They landed along the James River in what is today Virginia, named after, of course, the Virginia Company, named after Queen Elizabeth's supposed chastity. And so the settlers showed up, and of course, as you remember from the movie Pocahontas, they sang a song and started digging for gold because, of course, they'd heard the Spanish found massive gold and silver deposits. So they arrived on the coast of Virginia and began searching for gold. They built this triangular fort and met some Native American people who they immediately had conflict with because none of these settlers were prepared to live and farm in Virginia. And so they started stealing crops from the Native Americans, which led to some massacring, and then the Native Americans massacred them back. This conflict with the local Powhatan peoples was eventually solved by the intervention of Pocahontas, or probably more accurately, a ritual in which the leader of the English, John Smith, showed his inferiority before the Powhatan king in a ritual in which the daughter of the king pretended to stop John Smith from getting clubbed to death. But it doesn't matter. Either way, John Smith was able to convince the Powhatan people to stop killing the settlers, and he was able to convince the settlers to stop stealing food from the Native Americans. Unfortunately, then John Smith was injured in a gunpowder accident, and the settlers were attacked repeatedly, or started stealing food again, I should say, from the Native Americans. And the Native Americans, in retribution, burned down half of Jamestown. And it led to a period of famine and disease called the Starving Time, where there wasn't enough food. And somewhere around half the population died. Fortunately for the Virginians, another Englishman named John Rolfe showed up at about this time, having smuggled in a new crop from the Spanish colonies. This crop was called tobacco, and it was found to be easily cultivatable in the soil of Virginia, and it became the main cash crop that allowed Jamestown to survive. John Rolfe also then married Pocahontas, cementing a peaceful alliance between the settlers of Jamestown and the Powhatan peoples, and stopping the conflict for at least a time. This would hold for about 30 years until eventually the people of Jamestown, needing more land, broke the treaty, attacked the Powhatan people, and drove them off the coast. So that's the basic story of Jamestown. If you're interested in a dramatized version, you can, of course, watch the Disney film Pocahontas and Pocahontas 2, which are not at all an accurate representation of the conflict. Here's, of course, John Rolfe and Pocahontas getting married. I'm sure it was very romantic. Oh, Pocahontas, by the way, then went back to England where she died of smallpox. The other English colony that you're probably already aware of is Plymouth Colony. This is the one that was founded by the Pilgrims. Here it is, right on Cape Cod, up here in Massachusetts. The Pilgrims are noteworthy because they were separatist Puritans who had broken off from the Church of England, which we'll talk more about that later when we get to the mass migration of Puritans. But they were separatist Puritans who thought the Church of England was too Catholic with its bishops and episcopacy and stuff like that. So they first went to the Netherlands and then traveled all the way to the Americas, where they hoped to set up a colony where they could worship as they chose. So they set to building this colony in Plymouth, where they met local Native Americans, including a Native American named Squanto, who actually spoke English because he had previously been kidnapped by some English fishermen. So Squanto was able to negotiate a treaty between the Pilgrims, as we know them, and the local Native American tribe known as the Wampanoag peoples. This treaty was, of course, a military alliance where the Pilgrims agreed to help the Wampanoag attack another Native American tribe known as the Narragansett. And so with this joint military alliance, they were able to crush their enemies, and then they celebrated by having a feast, which we know, of course, as Thanksgiving. Exciting. Of course, over time, this has been mystified, and it's talked about how the Native Americans taught the Pilgrims how to survive, and then all this other nonsense that fits into our mythology where the Native Americans are pushed to the background. But it's important to note that the Native Americans were an active part of this alliance, getting military support and weapons in exchange for helping the Pilgrims to survive. And this is very indicative of the relationships between early Native American tribes and European settlers, with the Native Americans seeing the Europeans as a potential source of new technology, weapons, and a way to become the dominant tribe within their region. The French operated very differently from the English, whereas the English were practicing this type of settler colonialism. The French weren't particularly interested in that, interested is probably the wrong word. Well, I'll get into that in a minute. So, New France is the French colony that was set up along the St. Lawrence River, which was, as we mentioned, explored by Samuel de Champlain. As opposed to the English, which set up relatively large cities, the French were mostly setting up trading posts to control both the St. Lawrence River and then the Great Lakes. The French didn't come over in huge numbers for a variety of reasons, but the main reason is that whereas the English had a relatively had a growing and larger urban population because of the Industrial Revolution, who were willing to migrate, the French never really had that sort of population. The French were mostly still peasants tied to the land, and so there weren't large numbers of French people who were even free to come over to the New World if they so chose. First French emissaries to come were the Jesuits, who generally made peaceful contact with Native Americans and went to live among the Native Americans, with of course the goal of converting them to Christianity. But in a very practical sense for the French, this gave the natives contact with Europeans and gave the French, when the traders would come in, a French person who had some understanding of native customs. And so, whereas in both Jamestown and Plymouth, there was significant conflict between settlers and Native Americans, the French made mostly peaceful connections with the natives living within the borders of their quote unquote colony. French made money primarily through the trading of furs, which were very valuable in Europe. Of course, the French people could go hunt furs if they so chose, but it was much cheaper to pay Native Americans with European finished products in exchange for furs, which the natives were hunting anyway and were very efficient at hunting and trapping. So the meat groups, they'd go to pre-arranged trading posts where the Native Americans would show up with furs and they would trade them for goods that they wanted. This eventually led to the Beaver Wars, which was a war over fur trading grounds because as native tribes started to increase the amount of furs that they were trying to acquire in order to trade for more weapons, iron pots, and other finished goods that they were unable to produce themselves, they started to run into each other's territory. And so the Beaver Wars was a war between a group of Iroquois tribes, known as the Five Tribes in sort of upstate New York here, and a group of Algonquin peoples up here in Canada along the Great Lakes. In general, the English were supplying weapons to the Iroquois peoples, whereas the French were supplying weapons to the Algonquin. Here are your five Iroquois tribes of upstate New York here. And they are going to all be important later as we talk about English encroachment into their territory. But for now, the English were perfectly happy to simply sell weapons to these Native Americans and give them supplies in order to help them fight against the Algonquin peoples, because the English were primarily trading furs with the Iroquois. This was, of course, a massive war, mostly between Native American groups, and the end result was the Iroquois were able to defeat the Algonquin Confederation and were able to expand their fur trading range up into Lake Ontario here and right up along the border of the St. Lawrence River. And so the Beaver Wars also represent one of the effects of European encroachment, is that it led to intertribal conflict between Native Americans over access to resources that had now become increasingly valuable. So lots of things changing along the coast of North America and along the Great Lakes. So here are your objectives. Pause and make sure you can give a satisfactory answer to all of these